Welcome back to the Life on Books podcast. I'm your host, Tony, and today I'm joined by no one. Our faithful co-host, Andy, aka Metafictional Meathead, is indisposed today. He's with his girlfriend. I believe they're traveling for the weekend. I had some reservations about putting out a solo episode, but I thought I really wouldn't want to be a fan of a podcast that only put out episodes haphazardly and intermittently. So how can I expect you to do the same? So I appreciate everyone's support, and I did want to just have a conversation about books with you, because that is what this podcast is all about. It's about talking about books. It's for those of us who are so obsessed with the idea of books and writing and reading that we just want to talk about it and think about it all of the time. And I do think I have a fairly interesting episode for all of us today. At least I hope that is the case. But before we get into all of that, I wanted to touch base with all of you and ask you a question, which is, I've flirted with the idea of twice a month or maybe even once a week putting out an episode about book news, the latest going on in the publishing world, technologies related to reading, trends, those kinds of things. Just kind of like a report where I'll bring together all the different news I can find and relay it back to you in a very simple, straightforward manner. And I don't know if people would be interested in that. My inspiration for this is a fellow named Jared Polin, who runs a photography and videography related YouTube channel and social media accounts where he does quite a few different types of videos and content. He has a podcast about photography, but one of the recurring segments on his YouTube channel is photography news. I think maybe there's probably a little bit more in the way of photography news with camera releases and lens releases and other technologies related to a technical field. But I didn't know if that's something that you would be interested in. So let me know in the comments if that is something you would be interested in, if you would listen to it, what types of things you would like to hear about. Maybe I can save some people the trouble of going out and finding the news for themselves. And, again, just anything to drum up some conversation. So what I want to talk about today, and I really encourage you to comment as you're listening along, and I'll do my best to respond to all the comments, and maybe we can get a good dialogue going in the comment section, regardless of where you're watching or listening to this. Recently, I put out a video on both Instagram and TikTok about General Mattis, who was the former Secretary of Defense, I believe for Obama, but also for Donald Trump. They had a very public kind of disagreement, and he was relieved of his position. I think he resigned, but was clearly asked to resign. I don't think it was a willful act. Anyway, I made this video because I came across a quote of his about how reading is extremely important. He took it to an extreme, saying people who don't read are functionally illiterate, which I enjoyed the controversy of that statement in terms of I knew very well that it would get a reaction out of people, which is always good when you're making content, because you really don't make content for no one to see it or engage with it. But I don't necessarily share the extreme of that sentiment. But I got a lot of interesting comments, particularly on TikTok, where that video did about 10x the views as compared to Instagram. So currently, as of recording this, that video on TikTok has like 72,000 views on it. Many people obviously took offense to the concept of reading is better than other forms of learning about things. I could understand why someone might be offended by that. If you fancy yourself a smart or eloquent or curious or intelligent person and you don't read, you probably have a little bit of a chip on your shoulder when somebody says you have to read to be all of those things. And we know that that's not the case, but I do think that reading holds some distinct advantages over consuming other types of content and media. And I wanted to share my thoughts on that and also just hear feedback from anyone listening or watching. If you agree with me, if you disagree, if there's things that I didn't consider that you think books pose an advantage for, or maybe there's a disadvantage to reading that I'm not considering or seeing. One of the recurring themes in some of these comments from various people was that you can glean information in a number of ways, including listening to audiobooks, but also watching visual media. And I certainly agree with the audiobook portion of that, and I did take some time to look into some studies comparing reading comprehension to listening comprehension and memory retention. And I was actually a little bit surprised to find out that there really isn't a whole lot of difference between the two. One of the caveats being you have to be solely focused when you're listening to an audiobook, which I don't think a lot of people do. That's kind of why audiobooks exist, right? Because you can multitask, you can drive and listen, you can clean your home and listen, you can maybe even do some other type of work that requires some critical thinking and listening. There's been tons and tons of research on this regarding distracted driving, right? Like people who are having a phone conversation, which I understand is two-way, unlike an audiobook, but people just cannot fully participate in a conversation while they're driving, or if they do, their driving suffers. So obviously, if you are multitasking while listening to an audiobook, even though while you might get a lot of it, all of it's not going to stick. And of course, audiobooks have another huge advantage for people who are perhaps seeing impaired or have other maybe visual disabilities or learning disabilities that are visually related, and that's a great way for people to consume information. I kind of separate audiobooks out from watching video, documentaries, television shows, movies, because of the intention behind how they're created. So really, unless I could be mistaken on this, but I think most books, audiobooks, start with the written word in mind and then are converted to spoken word afterwards. Maybe there's people who go straight to audiobook. I don't know of any. Nothing jumps off the top of my mind. But the point is, there is a level of commitment, research, effort, persistence, and consistency required to write a quote-unquote book. And it doesn't really matter if you're listening to the end result or you're reading the end result. The effort that the creator had to put into creating it is still there, with either medium. Now, I'm not saying that people don't put a lot of effort into video essays on YouTube. That's something I've done in the past, and I recognize that they can be a tremendous amount of work. Obviously, cinematic productions require tons and tons of work. We're talking of like $100 million budgets for some films. Same thing for documentaries. The budgets can run in the millions easily. One of the big differences between those things, especially when you talk on higher scale documentary, is that it's a production of a large group of people. So you might have 2 or 3 people who wrote the script, for lack of a better term. Not all things are scripted out. Sometimes they just have a guideline, or they're just following where a particular story leads them, if it's a documentary, for example. But also you have people who are in charge of handling the lighting and the audio and the direction of the actors, and people who are controlling the budget and saying yes or no to certain things. There's so many people who do the grip work, the special effects, if there's any, the makeup, if there's any, the wardrobe, talent scouting. There's so many different positions for visual production. And while nobody does anything completely by themselves, right? Even writers have proofreaders and editors and maybe someone ghostwriting or assisting with them with their writing. It's still more of an act or an effort of a single person. And I think that's important because you get much more inside the head of that person, which is kind of the big thing that books really do for you, is they really help you see the world through somebody else's eyes. And this is true for fiction and nonfiction. A book that comes to mind is Dead Wake by Erik Larson. It's about the sinking of the Lusitania, and that happened during World War I. Some people incorrectly believe that it was the impetus for the United States joining the war. That's not true, which this book proves. So it's not Erik Larson's story. He has nothing to do with it personally, but it's still told through the lens of his perception, his way of storytelling, his way of writing. So you get to learn the facts as presented by him. And if you read his other works, there's a similar tone and style. And that is an impactful and meaningful and tangible part of this whole process. So that's point one with books. You have that really singular focus or perception from one person that really helps to put the consumer into their shoes. And great writers like Eric Larson can put you into other people's shoes really well too. So that's cool. Now let's put movies aside for a moment and let's just talk about YouTube and documentaries. I'm a huge fan of both of those things. I love YouTube. In fact, it might seem like I do more on things like Instagram and TikTok, but that's just because YouTube is extremely difficult. I think it's the hardest social media to grow on. And it does seem like books as a topic have kind of passed YouTube by. A few years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago even, BookTube was a big thing. There was a lot of book-related content. It was performing very well. Now it seems like all of that's shifted into more of the short-form stuff like Reels and TikTok. And it's kind of a bummer because I really love YouTube. I've used it extensively in my own life to learn things. In fact, I run a production company that does video production and some photography. I learned all of those skills through YouTube, completely self-taught on those endeavors. So it's an incredible resource. There's amazing information to be found on YouTube, but there's also no filter. And because of that, you get a lot of crap as well. Now, of course, there have been books that are published that have incorrect information in them. There have been books to be published that aren't very well written. They're just not that good. Obviously, art is subjective. However, there's some books that many people or most people will disagree. It's just not that good. But the thing about books is that for the majority of the modern world, books had to be published by a publishing company. And in order for that to happen, a book had to pass several clearances as far as quality, but also accuracy. Because if you if you published something that was defamatory or untrue, you could be potentially opening yourself up to a lawsuit, and that would be on the shoulders of the publishing company as well. So there was a lot more quality assurance in terms of the information historically. Now that's changing a little bit now with the prevalence of self-publishing, and there's also just so much coming out that it's hard to kind of keep tabs on everything. So there's probably a lot of books being published now with untrue things or really weird, disgusting takes on certain topics that are just not getting noticed because they're just getting lost in the sea of overall content being put out into the world. But I feel like you can trust the reliability of books much better than you can with other mediums. And I can't even tell you how many times I've seen documentaries that were done on my previous field, my area of expertise in my last career, that people would rant and rave about how incredible this documentary was and how life-changing it was. And I knew for a fact that the information presented in those documentaries was simply not true. And they skirted those legal obstacles or threats, if you will, very well and clearly very knowingly, presented in such a great way that it seemed completely true and believable, and the public at large ate it up. Of course, the same thing can be done with a book, but books are, again, more of a singular focus from a person, and so it's much easier to pinpoint the information back to that person and say, oh no, you were very clearly wrong about this. And the same thing that applies to documentaries also applies to YouTube. There are some excellently produced YouTube videos out there, some beautiful video essays that people clearly put a lot of time and effort into, but it's really just some guy or some gal at home kind of doing their own research, if you want to call it that, and putting together this presentation that might seem believable, but when you dig into it, it's just not credible in any way, shape, or form. And not only is there nobody there to quality assure their product, but there's just so much content on the internet anyway, no one's noticing if a few hundred people are indoctrinated by a piece of content that's simply incorrect. The other thing about books that I really appreciate compared to other forms of media is that the medium itself hasn't really changed. It's just typed words printed on paper. There's a lot of great older movies, a lot of great older documentaries that people will simply not sit through because the audio quality is very subpar compared to today's standards. The video quality is subpar compared to today's standards. People don't really necessarily like watching black and white video or hearing audio that sounds like it's coming out of a tin can when they're used to this high fidelity experience. So we do let a lot of older media in those formats just disappear and get lost in history, where you can read a book that was written 400 years ago, but you have a nice brand new printed copy and you still get the same message. Of course, the language might be a little bit different, might be archaic compared to how we speak now, but you get the point. It's not necessarily detracting from your enjoyment and thus dissuading you from experiencing it. Now, there was a point that was brought up several times on the comments of this General Mattis video, and that was basically summed up in this sentiment, which is reading doesn't necessarily make you better or smarter than other people. And I think that's 100% true. I would not argue with that point at all. And if that's what people took away from that video, I apologize, because that was not how I wanted people to feel after watching that. But I do think most people would agree with the idea that intelligent people do tend to read. Sometimes it might just be technical manuals for their job, but they do participate in some form of reading. And less intelligent, less curious, less aware people typically do not read. And I would never say that reading is an indication of intelligence, or actually, let me rephrase that. I would never say that reading is a guarantee of intelligence and not reading is a guarantee of idiocy or a lack of intelligence, but it is an indicator. It is a clue as to what this person's all about. A great example is if somebody has six-pack abs. Well, it's an indication that they probably live a healthy lifestyle. They may exercise regularly and eat a very healthy diet, but that doesn't guarantee that those things are true. Some people are just genetically, naturally very lean. They don't need to exercise much or watch what they eat. On the flip side, someone might exercise regularly and eat very well, but they are slightly overweight or maybe not up to our particular beauty standards in our society. But that doesn't mean that they're not a healthy person. It's just an indication potentially of what their lifestyle is like. But I think generally speaking, it's safe to say curious and smart people tend to read more books, and people who aren't interested in reading, maybe more often than not, are not above average intelligence. I don't really feel any reservations about making that statement. Again, I would never assume somebody's intelligence based on whether or not they read. I would just say if you correlated some type of intelligence test, I'm not even going to say IQ because there's problems with that, but some type of intelligence test with the amount of books they read, I'm willing to bet there would be a strong correlation between those two things. A great example is a conversation I was having with a person in person just the other day, and they were not asking this question in bad faith. Let me be clear about that. They had said, I don't want this question to sound racist, which is never a good way to start a sentence, but if people of color, if there's no difference between the races, essentially is what they're asking, why is it that people of color commit more crimes in the United States? Which is factually true. Last time I checked, the greater proportion of crimes were committed by people of color compared to Caucasians. In their mind, and this is a person I would consider fairly intelligent, highly successful for sure. In their mind, they could not see a reason or a differentiator other than skin color. So they were saying, I have been told repeatedly that there's no fundamental difference between white, black, brown, whatever. But if that's true, then why is this one group of people who the only differentiator I can see is skin color, why are they behaving differently? Anybody who knows about the history of people of color in the United States knows why this is, right? They have a long-standing history of being put into situations where they were not able to be afforded the same opportunities as other people, whether that was getting a mortgage, going to a good school, having the mobility to move to a different area if they wanted to, being confined to areas with less resources, higher crime rates, which perpetuates these problems, right? I said, well, do you know what redlining is? And they said, no. Okay. Do you know what the Jim Crow era was? They said, no. Okay. So if we're measuring intelligence by someone's ability to learn things, this person could be extremely intelligent. But because they hadn't been reading, because they hadn't been exploring the world beyond what they've experienced firsthand via books, well, they didn't know about these things that have a great impact on people's lives today, even though redlining and Jim Crow happened 100 years ago. Now, of course, you could get this information from a movie. You could get this information from a documentary. You could even get this information from a YouTube. Maybe you're watching this right now and you're learning about these things for the first time. However, I would say that books do a much more thorough job of connecting the consumer of the content with the message and the information itself. Books can go much deeper than movies can. That's why people always say that the book was better than the movie. Oh, they left out this part that I really enjoyed. Yeah, because they only have 2 hours. They have to cram in 500 pages, which took somebody potentially years to write, into a 2-hour film. They have to cut some stuff out. They have to leave it on the cutting room floor. Documentaries can be very in-depth. I think of like the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary, which is fantastic. It's 10 episodes. They're each about an hour long, so it's 10 hours of content. Ken Burns is a world-class, award-winning documentarian. I watched that. I learned so much about Vietnam. And guess what? I've been reading books about Vietnam this year, and I'm still learning things because I'm read The Sympathizer by Viet Thong Nguyen. And I'm terrible with Asian names, so I apologize to him. I mean, he wrote The Sympathizer, which talks about the immigrant experience from fleeing Vietnam when Saigon fell to the United States and how these refugees were treated. And, you know, it's just a perspective that doesn't really talked about in Ken Burns' documentary. So there's just so much to some of these topics. They're so deep that it's not enough to watch one YouTube video or one documentary or even read one book. And I think that's why people who are avid readers tend to have an advantage over people who don't read, because it's unlikely that I'm going to read one book about a topic like, let's say, Vietnam. No, I'm going to read multiple books about that. But are you really going to watch multiple documentaries about it? Or are you going to watch multiple movies about it? You might watch multiple YouTube channels, but again, you have to question the source of the information on a self-published product like a YouTube video. It's just one of those things where I understand why people would feel like readers are being elitist, and that's, in my opinion, not the case. I certainly have gone through periods in my life where I read much less than I do now, or how I read previously even. So, you know, I didn't become dumber during those periods where I was reading less, but I think I was less thoughtful. I was potentially not reaching my potential mentally. I think that books sharpen your mind or stimulate your mind in a way that other activities don't. I think reading is a little bit more engaging than watching a movie or a documentary. And that was actually shown in some of the studies I looked at. Readers, particularly those with lower reading comprehension, had to work harder. Their brains literally worked harder to process the information, which I actually think is a good thing, which is probably why we like to read difficult books. Readers who get into reading, they might start with something simple and then they progress to more challenging reads because they miss that kind of stimulation that a more challenging read gave you. And so if you have less reading comprehension, they give you, in this study they were I'm not sure what they were reading, but people with worse reading comprehension were working harder. Well, effectively, that's the same as someone with good reading comprehension reading something very difficult to read. There's a lot of advantages to it. I'm really on the fence to say if I think everyone should read or not. Obviously, there are those who cannot. There are those who are visually impaired. In that case, I think audiobooks are great. I mean, I think audiobooks are great anyway. Don't get me wrong. But there's some people that audiobooks is their only choice. So for some people, physically reading written words on paper is not a possibility. And I totally appreciate that. But for those who it is, I have a hard time saying, oh, you don't have to read. I feel like if you can, you should. I think that if you find the right stuff, everyone could like reading. And a lot of people say, oh, I just don't like doing it. Well, you probably just haven't found the right thing yet. Maybe that's manga. Maybe that's graphic novels. Maybe it's nonfiction. Maybe it's fantasy. It could be something you would never expect. Sometimes I read books in genres that I've never read before or previously had no interest in, and I found them to be very meaningful to me and have become some of my favorite books. So anyway, I have rambled long enough. This is a half-hour solo episode, which is long enough to just hear from one person. But please, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Am I being too egotistical, too arrogant, too elitist? What are your thoughts? Should people read? Should everyone read if they have the ability to do so? Is it okay not to? Are there some ways of learning that are better than reading, in your opinion? What are the advantages to something like watching a documentary over reading, assuming that it's not due to maybe an impairment that prevents you from reading? I would love to know your thoughts. Please participate in the conversation, and we will be back soon with Andy and other guests very soon.